Hey, this is Michelle at the top of the show. The audio's not going to be particularly great on this, because I'm trying to get this out very quickly because it's a month late, and I would like to explain why very briefly, and also apologise to Christine Burns and Lord Michael Cashman, who are on the show today. They should have been on the show a month ago, and that's on me because I got sick. So sorry this took so long. Thank you for being very patient and very, very, very fucking cool. But basically I got a bit sick because I lost a lot of hope for like a month there. Like, things looked really grim. And I think, like, a year and a half of being cut off from my community definitely affected me. And because I couldn't see my community, I couldn't feel hope for it, if you see what I mean. I think a lot of people listening to this will be able to empathise with that. But then something amazing happened, and I want to very briefly talk about this before the actual show starts. Well, it was two things, really. There was Trans Pride London, which is going to be half of next week's show, where I talk about what I saw there, and we're going to have speeches from all sorts of amazing people who spoke on the day. And I saw thousands of trans people gathered together, even though it was very dangerous to do so. The pandemic is still on. There were 2 anti-mask protests, led by far-right goons, going on just down the road from where we were. We risked police violence, we risked all sorts of things, and thousands of trans people showed up anyway. And that was everything. It gave me absolute life. And then something really strange on Twitter happened. I did some tweets about the need for more trans prides, like monthly trans prides forever. And I've done call-outs and calls to action before. But then in the mentions, some people went and actually made Trans Pride Birmingham happen in the mentions of tweets that I put out. And this is not me claiming responsibility for Trans Pride Birmingham existing. Like, that wasn't me. I did some tweets, other people came in and did the work to make it something real, and you'll be hearing more about that on the show, because I got a press pass. I got myself a press pass for that. But that just got me thinking, like, there is definitely hope, There actually is, and it's going to come from us. And I think I needed to see that. So that really helped me. So this is kind of an advert for the next episode of the pod. We're going to go into this more, going to go into what Trans Pride London did. Because I think, and I don't believe in turning points, because history is not ending. It's never about one moment. It's never about that. Like, the gay liberation movement didn't start at Stonewall. It had a few years to cook, and Stonewall kind of became the focal point. But I don't know. There's a lot of hope to be built on from that event. So I encourage you, even if you don't have a Twitter account, go on at What the Trans on Twitter, find it, and look at the images that were posted if you're feeling a bit down. And know that people like you took over London. There's nothing we can't do. And that's what helped turn me round. I felt that was important to share because I know I get messages all the time from people who have lost that hope for the same reasons I did. And a lot of this episode is going to feel a little bit old, a little bit out of date even. We're going to be covering stuff that happened a month ago, but a lot of it is still very relevant. And there are fights happening, so look out in your community to join those fights and go out there and get some hope. Go out there and find your communities, because God, it did the trick. Best medicine ever. So thank you to Christine Burns and Michael Cashman for being so patient as I got my shit together, and thanks to the organisers of Trans Pride London for making an event that honestly is one of the best days of my life. And that's enough from me. On with the show.
The category is What the Trans Darlings.
Well, hello. Welcome to the podcast. It's a podcast. It's What the Trans, the podcast.
What the Trans?
Yes, indeed. What the Trans? The question that is on a very small sector of the population's lips. But yes, here we are doing our news thing. Thank you for joining us once again. How are you, Michelle?
I'm good. I got a little story to tell.
Oh, yes. Yes, I think I know this story. Do go on. Tell us the tale. Spin us the yarn.
So, found out that Graham Linehan wrote about me.
Yes.
And so I did the thing where I just messaged everyone being like, band down the hatches. We could get some flying monkeys in. Like, I messaged you. I messaged some other people. Just like, let's be careful. And then nothing happened. At all. And then I looked up what he wrote and found out why. He wrote it a month ago. He wrote it weeks ago.
And we didn't even notice.
No, didn't even notice. Didn't even crack through like the normal level of radiation that is being a trans thing online. Like, it was a bit of an uptick a few weeks back of people being a bit shitty about stuff, but I was just like, that's not out the realms of normal, really. You didn't even notice. So, Graham, if you hate listening, you got no power, son.
Yes.
You can't do shit.
It's not working for you. And I'm sorry that your Pizza Blast email thing that you do, because that's what this is, right? What's it called? A Substack? It's like a...
Yeah, it's a newsletter blog that people pay £5 for.
Wow.
And I did some little analysis of his money because it was amusing to me to do so. 2013, his production company, Delightful Industries, had 175,000 odd quid in assets. 2019, latest figures, £1,000. His company could buy a bit of a shit car.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I looked around, couldn't find any other income stream for him outside of his old TV shows that he may get some money for in some way. And looking at his Substack, basically people pay £5 a month to receive his shit, and you can also get his shit for free if you really want. So it's free shit, but people can choose to pay money, but they get the right to comment or like a post, basically, if they pay as a premium thing. Like his highest one that I found was like 200 likes.
Okay.
So at that point he had a minimum of 200 subscribers. Now he could have thousands. There's no way of knowing. They're not public, but I don't think he does.
Well, he could have thousands, but they're not responding to any of the material. So maybe people. But that's the like. It's like you've seen Brooklyn Nine-Nine, right? And
Yeah.
So Charles Boyle, the food-obsessed detective in there, and he talks about his Pizza Blast email that goes out, and then Captain Holt subscribes to it to everyone else's surprise. Like, why do you subscribe to that? Because it's the only one that grades mouthfeel. And I was like, yes, is that a slightly trans joke? I don't know. But it just kind of seems like that, this kind of really small-minded thing that goes out to a fairly small group of people.
Yeah.
And doesn't affect anything else that happens in the world, obviously, because he's done this whole blast on you, which completely passed us by for several weeks. So
yeah, like he can't even get to the people he's targeting.
Yeah.
And Substack on their website have a little tool where, like, I don't want to call them creators, but that's what they call them, where creators can assess, like, can estimate how much money they're going to get by a certain level of subscribers. So I put in 400 subscribers at the level that Linehan offers on his Substack. It was something like 1,580 quid a month, which is about what you would get if you worked minimum wage for 40 hours a week.
In a call center or something, yeah.
So he's traded in a TV career to be paid minimum wage online to write about me.
Hey, well done. Absolutely. I mean, when I first heard the term Substack, I thought, wow, a Dom could have a tremendous fun with a Substack. But then it turns out I completely misunderstood the principle.
Yeah, I don't think you're right for Substack. I mean, it appears to be sort of a place where transphobes go once Twitter is close to them.
Yeah. Oh, well, there we go. Well, have fun there, guys, because nothing you say will make any difference anywhere else.
It really won't. It took a month for me to find out.
Yep.
He can't even target the people he's targeting anymore. Like a year ago or like 2 years ago, he writes about you somewhere. It's like thousands of people. And now it's just like nothing. So that'll be the final time we ever talk about Graham Linehan on here.
I don't think it will be, but I admire your optimism.
Well, no, because he's nothing. He's just another anti-trans weirdo online now. That's it. He's no more powerful than like your faceless I Heart JK nightmares that occasionally crop up. You just block them and move on. I don't think he can actually do anything anymore.
Yeah, all those Twitter accounts with, I love JK Rowling 7465321, just loads of numbers after it.
He's one of them now.
Account created 48 hours ago, and it's like, okay.
Yeah, he's just one of them now, so this will be the final time we ever talk about Graham Linehan. I'm putting my money on the table. So to draw a line under that, how are you doing?
I'm fine. I didn't have anything anywhere near as exciting happen to me this week.
It really wasn't that exciting.
I know it wasn't exciting. It was hilarious, but I'm not sure it was exciting. Yeah, I'm all right. I'm just trying to think if there's any... darling housemate, whose name I will not reveal, has a VR headset now, like one of the ones that you can just attach to one of the several games consoles that are available. And so there's been lots of demoing and playing of actual games, including some from Squanch Games, which is Justin Roiland, the guy who does Rick and Morty. And basically all of the games, I've played 2 of the games now that company has produced, and boy, you can tell it's him. The humor's the same, the voice is the same, and the way the characters interact with each other. And it's funny for the first 20 minutes or so, and then it just becomes slightly irritating. It's like, okay, I get it. Well done. You can do high-pitched voices. But
I've heard that general criticism of VR games in general, that for 20 minutes is amazing, and then it's just like, oh, what am I doing? And everything hurts.
True, yes. Oh, God, definitely. There's one called Super Hot, which is not a squanch game. I think it's been out for a little while, but basically time only moves when you move. So you've got a little while to kind of react to things that happen, but then, you pick things up and throw them in slow motion to sort of defeat the... But me and housemates spent a good couple of nights crawling all over this game, and the pair of us were in such aches and pains the next day because we'd been, very slowly moving around and holding ourselves in dodge positions to avoid getting shot and whatever. So in terms of a short demo, there was one for Eve Valkyrie, which is a spaceflight game, which I am all over that, obviously. As you know, I'm a space enthused person. But the demo is like 20 seconds. You get launched out of the mothership, you maybe shoot 1 or 2 baddies down, and then that's it. And it's like, well, now buy the full game. It's like, okay. But yes, VR, Adventures in VR, it's highly amusing. Resident Evil was recently purchased, and so I've had to exercise tremendous amount of restraint not to deliberately make my housemate jump while she's playing it, just to sort of freak her out and see if I can get her to scream.
I mean, well done. I don't think I would have that kind of restraint.
It's been a challenge, I must say. But anyway, we've got a lot to get through this episode, haven't we? We've got a fair chunk of stuff. Some of it's jolly exciting, some of it's jolly interesting. Well, we hope all of it's jolly interesting, actually.
We've got a packed out show, again like last time. We've got the second half of our interview with Christine Burns.
Indeedy.
Which is endlessly fascinating and a lesson in history, and also chock full of wonderful advice. So
absolutely.
Stick around for that. But before that, what's up next? Oh no, not the news.
Not the news, yeah.
All right, let's just do this. So there has been some stuff going on in Parliament. There's been stuff going on in the government. So here is a summary of all of that. And I'm going to attempt to be painting a pretty grim picture that is not only relevant for trans people, but for the whole LGBT community and pretty much every other minority group in the UK too. So let's get into this. So on the Friday before Christmas in December last year, Liz Truss gave a speech at a think tank in London where she outlined the government's new focus when it comes to equality policy. It was a real good time, where Minister for Women and Equalities Liz Truss announced a move away from focusing on identity politics and moving towards focusing on the one equality issue that affects cisgender, heterosexual white Britons, geographical inequality. Alongside this, she announced that the government would be moving away from listing purely to specialised groups. Of course, this alarmed and enraged many in the LGBT community, as this was read as a sign that the government was abandoning listening to them and abandoning making attempts to advance LGBT equality. When it comes to trans people specifically, there was one segment of this speech that we don't think got enough attention. Here is Liz Truss from last December talking about where the left has failed. The left! The gosh darn left.
Yeah.
Here is Liz Truss from last December talking about where the left has failed to protect equality.
It's led to the left turning a blind eye to practices that actively undermine equality, whether it be failing to defend single-sex spaces, hard fought for by generations of women, enabling and tolerating anti-Semitism, or the appalling grooming of young girls in towns like Rotherham. Although time and time again, the left's ideas have been shown to fail, they still pervade our body politic.
I think it's safe to say we can all guess who she is talking about, the left failing to protect single-sex spaces from. And I think this should serve as a warning over what is to come from Liz Truss. But that's for another day. We're going to cut back to the 25th of May this year, yesterday at time of recording, where Liz Truss was called to give evidence to the Women and Equality Select Committee for their inquiry into the role of the Government Equalities Office. There, Truss was grilled by Labour MP Alex Davies-Jones. So let's go through that moment by moment, because there's a lot of things there. There's a lot of things that came out of their face that are not great. First up, Truss was asked to respond to accusations by former members of the government's now defunct LGBT advisory panel that the government had created a hostile environment for the LGBT community. These accusations came from a hearing held on the 19th of this month, where former panellist Jane Ozan said that the panel started well, but went downhill tremendously from September 2019. It should be noted that Liz Truss was given the role of Minister for Women and Equalities in September of 2019. Orzan went on to express her frustration at the feeling that Truss was not interested in hearing from the panel. Here is Liz Truss's response to this that she gave to Davies-Jones yesterday on the 25th.
The LGBT panel were appointed by the previous government, and they were appointed on a time-limited basis until the end of March this year. And of course, we're grateful for the contribution they made, but I think there were fundamental disagreements, namely, members of the panel supported self-ID for gender recognition certificates. And I very strongly feel, as I've made clear, that there need to be checks and balances. So I think the issue here is fundamentally a difference of opinion on that issue.
Jane Orzan, along with fellow former members of the panel, Ellen Murray, Executive Director of Transgender NI, and former manager of the Scottish Trans Alliance, James Morton, resigned earlier this year from the panel in protest to what they described as the hostile environment towards LGBT people by this government, and particularly to highlight the hostility facing trans people. The government went on to bin the entire panel, and it appears that Truss is saying one of the reasons why was because she disagreed with them on GRA reform. How splendid! How splendid is that? Amazing.
Yeah.
Next, Truss was asked if the government were going to move on the government's LGBT action plan. For those who are unaware, the LGBT action plan was drawn up and released in 2018 by the government under Theresa May. This plan was put together based on the results of the LGBT survey launched by the government in 2017, where over 100,000 LGBT people responded with information about the issues they faced in their lives. The action plan, as a result of the survey, included a wide range of aims, including tackling homophobic and transphobic bullying, analysing deeply entrenched discrimination, and included the promise to set aside £4.5 million to implement the plan. Here is what Liz Truss had to say when she was asked if she intended to honour the commitments in the LGBT plan.
We've set out our plan for LGBT advancement of rights. So I've talked earlier about the LGBT International Conference. That will be the first one that the United Kingdom has ever held on the theme of Safe to Be Me, showing our global leadership on the issue. We're also, in the Queen's speech, announced that we will be legislating to ban conversion therapy in this country. And we're also working hard to make sure, working with business to make sure there is good support for LGBT people in business, particularly small business. So those are the priorities as I've set them out. And I will be appointing an LGBT panel in due course to support those priorities.
Okay. Well, the LGBT Action Plan, as you will know, commits that the GEO provide yearly updates to this committee on its implementation. But this committee hasn't had an update since July 2018. Why is that?
It's probably because there's a new government in place under the leadership of Boris Johnson.
So we should scrap the previous LGBT Action Plan.
Well, what I'm saying is that was set out by the previous administration. I have laid out what our priorities are. The Prime Minister made clear in the Queen's speech that we are moving forward on banning conversion therapy, on the LGBT conference, and those are our priorities.
So it is probably safe to assume that this LGBT action plan that came from the government, listening to the submissions of over 100,000 LGBT people, is gone. It's just not a thing. And it appears to be gone because the government have their own focus on banning conversion therapy after holding a public consultation on the issue, because why not ask everyone before banning torture, and hosting a global LGBT conference called Free to Be Me, which I am sure everyone listening to this will find almost as darkly funny as we do, considering the binning of GRA reform, which would have allowed trans people to be themselves more freely. Next, Truss was asked to comment on the concern and outrage ignited by the speech she gave in December, which I referenced at the top of this segment, where she first announced the government's absurd new focus for equalities, and she was asked if she meant to single out specialised groups, including LGBT organisations, for criticism. This was her response.
My aim in the speech was to broaden the equality agenda so that it is relevant to everybody in our country. Because as I say, I come from the point of view of every person is important, their humanity and dignity is important, and we should be looking at the inequality people face across the board. So my aim isn't to exclude people. My aim is to make this not a specialized conversation amongst a few groups, but a much broader conversation across the whole country. That's why we're relocating the Equality Hub to the north of England.
I mean, it's nice that she didn't aim to do that, but she did.
Yeah.
So Truss later on in the inquiry hearing went on to announce that there would be a new panel, a new LGBT panel, and plans for this would be announced, quote unquote, in due course. As well as announcing that she will be giving a speech in July where she will announce the results of a new data-driven analysis of equality and will reveal more specific details on what these plans are and what her plans will be. So watch out for that. So, to summarise, the LGBT action plan is almost certainly dead, but never mind, they are hosting a conference on LGBT stuff that's all global and stuff. That'll surely be cool, right? Well, here is a clip featuring a very pointed question by Select Committee Chair Caroline Noakes.
In your comments just now, you spoke about Safe to Be Me and the conference that you're setting up. Do you include organisations like the Evangelical Alliance in that space?
Well, I don't have any comment on that specific organisation, Chair.
The Evangelical Alliance are an organisation that represents thousands of churches all around the UK, and it should be noted, have come out against a conversion therapy ban, so that is cool.
Yeah.
They sound like the right people to bring to this conference where it's all about being free to be me.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot there, Ashley.
There is, yeah.
What did you make of that? Did you find that as I have to laugh or I'll cry as I did?
Absolutely, but of course, it's all the left's fault. The left!
The left!
Oh, damn you, the left, who haven't been in power for such a long time and yet are still being blamed for literally everything that this government has failed to do. It's just... So, none of this is surprising, is it, really? We've kind of been watching Liz Truss with mounting horror and suspicion since September 2019, and I actually remember the day I heard that. I found out that Liz Truss was the Equalities Minister, and I was at a conference, like a specifically trans-related conference with the LGBT Foundation, and it came up in one of the panels, and because everybody was aware that the Equalities Minister was about to be changed and reshuffled and stuff, and so, the question went out, does anybody know who the Equalities Minister is? And I'd looked at my phone like not 5 minutes prior to that and seen that it was Liz Truss, so I had to stand up and say, yeah, it's Liz Truss, actually. And you should have heard the groan that went up in this room, because she's the Trade Secretary, or, Minister for International Trade, which at the moment is a big job, given that there's that whole other thing that the Conservatives have insisted we do, to wit, Brexit. So now Liz Truss and her team are responsible for renegotiating, the whole idea of international trade with the entire bloody world, and yet she's also been given the equalities brief. And we did hear at the time certain whisperings, rumblings, whatever, from people in Westminster who said that she's been given that to strangle it, basically. She's been given that.
She's doing a top job.
She absolutely is. She's doing a splendid job. But with this conference, it's fucking Orwellian, isn't it? It's like the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere or something, and it's just...
I can't wait for it, weirdly. I mean, I'm going to be going for press. Of course I am.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
I'm in the city it's happening, and I can't not go there and just watch it be a total fucking disaster.
Yeah, an absolute bloody train wreck, isn't it? I mean, so that's what we hope. But there was a kind of another development on this just today, as we record this, as part of Prime Minister's Questions, which happens every Wednesday morning. And we have a clip of an MP called Crispin Blunt asking the Undersecretary for Equality, so the person who works underneath Liz Truss, Kemi Badenoch, about how the conference can be called Free to Be Me when trans people aren't. And, well, you'll hear the clip.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend yesterday at the Select Committee said she ended the role of her LGBT advisory panel because of a basic disagreement over the right of trans people to self-ID. Argentina, our co-chair of the Equal Rights Coalition, whose conference we host next June, legally accommodated self-ID for trans people since 2012 without a problem, as are now more members of the coalition following Argentina's example without a problem. How is she going to find a new panel that has both authority and agrees with her in the continuing refusal to accept the right of trans people to self-ID? And can she explain how Britain can host a conference entitled Safe to be Me without supporting the right to be me?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. The former LGBT advisory panel's tenure ended on the 31st of March 2021. I am grateful to its members for their important insights, and they've provided on important policy areas such as ending conversion therapy and the impact of COVID on LGBT people. The PM has appointed Lord Herbert as Special Envoy for LGBT rights. This role will have an international and domestic focus, and I am confident that we will be able to work with our international partners on this issue. We believe the current provisions within the Act allow for those who wish to legally change their gender to do so. It is safe to be them, and they do have the right to be themselves, and we've therefore decided, as we've said before to the honourable gentleman, that the Gender Recognition Act will not be changed.
So the response was a bit nonsense, really, because, I mean, yeah, technically she's correct. A GRA does exist, and does provide a method to change birth certificate and whatever, but it's not equality, is it?
It just completely bounced over Crispin Blunt's point, which is like, we're holding an international conference. Argentina's probably going to show up. Argentina have had, quote-unquote, self-ID for years, and it's not been a problem. How could we be like, oh, in this country, you are free to be you, we are free to be me, when trans people aren't?
Yeah. Yeah.
And she was just like, I'm just gonna pretend that part of the question didn't happen and just talk a load of shit about the conference and talk about GRA that I'm just reading from quotes and things that would come up for me to read whenever this came up, because it's the same. It's almost word for word the same lines that Truss was saying in the committee hearing.
Well, I mean, it's exactly the same lines. Respectfully, I think Truss and Badenoch are just the two worst possible people to be in the roles that they're in. Inequalities ministers, really.
Well, it depends on their aim and their goal. If it is to strangle equality, they've picked the right people.
Then, well done.
One last thing before we move on was in regards to when Truss was speaking to the committee, saying that one of the reasons, or maybe the reason, why the LGBT panel was sort of disbanded was that there was a disagreement over GRA reform.
Yes, yeah.
Jane Ozan, again, former member of the panel, tweeted out that Truss says there was a fundamental difference of opinion with her and the panel. She hadn't met us to talk about matters when she announced her plans. So that raises a question of how did she know she disagreed with the panel if she's never gosh darn talked about it with them or mentioned that, we're going to do this now.
Well, so I think the fundamental disagreement was Liz Truss doesn't believe in equality, and the panel did, and so she thought, well,
panel is gone.
So I'm going to get rid of these people. These people, it's not a very scientific outlook, is it? Because that method is you alter your theory to fit the known facts, whereas what Truss is doing trying to do is altering the facts to fit her preconceived notions. And that is, as I'm sure I don't need to say to anybody who's listening to this, that is an extremely dangerous impulse, particularly from somebody in government. So obviously we'll be keeping an eye on this, as we always do. And
we'll definitely have more on the speech in July if it happens.
Absolutely.
Although Liz Truss does have a history of promising to give speeches in July, and then they don't happen.
And then it's
months later we find out horrible shit.
I'll be interested to see as well when and if this conference, Free to Be Me, does take place, if they even give you a press pass for it. In fact, let's both go. That would be hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know what it would look like. Like, would it just be a bunch of delegates voting on stuff? Or, like, what? I don't even know what they're going to do there.
It's going to be talks, isn't it? And chances are so if they get anybody to talk who doesn't fit their view of things, then they're going to get absolutely crucified, like on stage, verbally, in front of hundreds of visitors from all over the world, or it's going to be the most anti-LGBT conference since the Evangelical Alliance, really. Anyway.
Yeah, the Evangelical Alliance might even be there. We don't know. Truss didn't say. We'll find out later. But yeah, we should probably move on.
Yes, let us move on. We've been on this for long enough. So, on the subject, quite definitely, on the subject of legal gender recognition. A couple of weeks ago, we mentioned a government petition entitled Make Non-Binary a Legally Recognised Gender Identity in the UK that surpassed 130,000 signatures, that's a lot. For an issue like this, for a specifically LGBT and specifically trans issue, that is really a lot. So it passed 130,000 and got a response from the government. Hooray! But predictably, it was bullshit. The response stated, as set out in the response to the Gender Recognition Act consultation, there are no plans to make changes to the 2004 Act. The government noted that there were practical, complex consequences for other areas of the law, service provision and public life if provision were to be made for non-binary gender recognition in the GRA. So, as you can probably tell with the silly voice that I'm doing, this was widely met with derision, outrage, and a certain amount of upset within the trans community, even though there had been some debate on the topic of non-binary recognition as to whether it was a good thing to campaign for that instead of campaigning for the abolition of legal gender recognition in its entirety. Now, we are aiming to get some non-binary folks on to talk about their views on this, but in their response to the petition, the government stated, "This government wants everybody in the UK to feel safe and confident to be themselves."
Really?
Really? Honestly? Are you actually saying that? The fucking audacity of you. Safe to say, everything that they have actually done has made it clear that this, it could be argued, may not be entirely true. I certainly don't think it is. This government wants everybody who is white, cisgendered and rich in the UK to feel safe and confident to be themselves. Everybody else can fuck off and die of COVID, as far as the government are concerned.
Saying that, I don't think there was ever going to be a response other than this. I try not to say it was impossible that something may move, like there may be some kind of quote-unquote debate in Parliament, but that, when people hear that, they see MPs on both sides having a big old shouting match in a packed-out House of Commons. Technically, a debate in Parliament could take place in one of the many, many different back rooms in a completely different building across the road from the Houses of Parliament, or it could even just be a debate as in someone writes in a question, then a few people write in answer to that question, it ends up on the Parliament website and nobody ever knows it ever happened.
I know exactly what you mean. It's exactly what we expected, but occasionally we must allow ourselves to hope.
Yeah.
And that was what this petition represented, wasn't it? It was a hope that, well, maybe this effort they're making to look like they're good on LGBT stuff, maybe they might actually do some stuff, but obviously they won't. But still,
the annoying thing is that they seem to be speaking. I mean, they're speaking over us,
absolutely,
for us, being like, see, we believe that these things are fine. And I don't know how many different ways the trans community and the LGBT community, in more broader terms, has said, no, it isn't.
No, it is not.
It just, at this point, it feels kind of like gaslighting, just like, it's fine. No, it isn't, but it is, though. No, but it really isn't, but it is. Oh. But no, it isn't. I think because they're not talking to us.
No, they're not.
They're not sending that message out to LGBT people. They're sending that message out to the press and the rest of the country to be like, we've got this covered. We're fine. We're good on LGBT stuff, aren't we? And
aren't those LGBT people being unreasonable by asking for really basic fucking stuff? Yeah. So it's just. It's not a surprise, but it's just so disheartening, isn't it? Nevertheless, when the next one of these petitions comes up, I will sign it and share it, as I always do, and will allow myself to hope once again, perhaps foolishly.
What I'm about to say may have made more sense talked about in the previous segment, but it kind of applies to here too, where the government's equality plan appears to be, I mean, based on what was said in the rest of the committee hearing and other stuff that's been going on for months now, the message we've been getting from government is that they want to move towards focusing on regional inequality, right? So they want to get rid of this listening to non-binary people thing. They want to get rid of listening to LGBT people thing. And they want to look at why there is a wage gap between the North and the South, which they want to really investigate this, Ashley, which is It's a mystery as to why the South, which has been getting all of the money for years and has London in it where all of the high-paying jobs are, why there may be a wage gap. Why is this mystery? What happened there?
What a mystery it is, given that London sucks. And I'm not... No, I'm not saying that... No, I am not saying that to say that London is shit and is rubbish. I'm saying London literally sucks the money, the lifeblood out of the rest of the country and centres it around itself. And it's just so infuriating that, like, the buses that I rode to school and college on were, you know, they had fucked suspension, they were ancient, the chairs were old.
Oh yeah, when I was growing up in Yorkshire, several times, repeatedly, windows would fall out of the bus that we were on. That was a thing that happened because the North isn't getting any money. It wasn't really getting that much money under Labour when they were in. It's getting even less after 11 years of Tory cuts. So
80% of the transport budget for the entirety of the UK goes to one city. And that's... So the thing is, they're talking about, oh, why is there this wage gap? Why is there geographical inequality? That is a real thing. It is, and it affects more people than trans issues.
But it's no fucking mystery. They don't need to investigate it. We already know.
Yeah, they already know because they did it in the first place. But they want to get more people on their side. And they want, so there's, you know, traditionally there's that whole red wall thing, which seems to have collapsed. The traditional Labour heartlands, some of which have gone blue. And now they're thinking, well, hey, let's make some more of them go blue by actually giving them some money. But again, given that...
But I don't think it's going to work, because do you really think that they're going to change up that much there?
No,
they're putting all of their government equality stuff onto this idea that, right, we're going to look at this problem now and fuck all of the minorities. But it just doesn't feel like a great plan, especially because they're going to be doing investigations that cost loads of money into why it is this way when everybody already knows the answer.
They're not. They're just going to make it look like they're doing. They're going to put a veneer of investigation onto it and carry on dishing out money to all of their friends the same way they've always done. That's how the Tories work.
The most perfect example of how ridiculous their view is when during the hearing yesterday that Liz Truss was giving, she was saying the wage gap between the North and the South, that is an Equalities Office issue. That is a government Equalities Office issue. Another MP, and I can't remember, another member of the committee asked about the ethnic minority wage gap. And she was like, oh, that's an issue for the Department of Business. Because it can't be racism. It's got to be a business issue. It's got to be some other magical thing in the business world as to why that's a thing. That's not an equalities issue. It just shows exactly where the focus is. Equality issue, North-South divide, that's an equality issue. Racism, that's not an equality issue. That's a business thing. We're going to punt it off to them. These people are a joke. Stop voting for them if you have been. Although if you have been, don't know why you're listening to us. But anyway, we've got one last thing, right?
Moving on. Finally, Stonewall have been in the news again, and the reasons are as ridiculous as they are frustrating. So here's a quick summary of what's been going on. Multiple media outlets, including The Times, The Telegraph, and of course the BBC, have reported that a report, referred to as the Reindorf Report, claiming that Stonewall had potentially given guidance on the Equality Act that had misrepresented the law to members of its Diversity Champions Programme. The Diversity Champions Programme is a scheme by Stonewall to assist employers who sign on to the scheme in ensuring that they are as inclusive as possible to their LGBT employees. The Reindorf report itself was about quote-unquote no platforming in universities and cited an example of two anti-trans nightmare people being disinvited from speaking at the University of Essex, and the University of Essex is a member of the Diversity Champions Programme. The report claimed that the advice given by Stonewall was inaccurate because Stonewall said that the Equality Act covers transgender people, but the Equality Act itself only features the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. Now, this is a very popular arguing point by the anti-trans nightmare crowd, where they can claim that the protected characteristic of gender reassignment does not cover all transgender people. They variously argue that non-binary people do not come under that label, nor does any trans person who doesn't have some sort of bottom surgery. However, that is not what the Equality and Human Rights Commission has been saying in their guidance ever since the Equality Act started existing in 2010. They have said repeatedly that the phrase gender reassignment covers transgender people regardless of what medical treatments they may or may not have had. And this view on it was recently affirmed in the courts when LGB Alliance co-founder Ann Sinnott attempted a judicial review on this and was soundly rejected, as we have covered in a previous episode. Also, in December of last year, an employment tribunal ruled that non-binary people are indeed covered by the phrasing gender reassignment under the Equality Act. So, Stonewall then do not appear to have given bad advice. But that didn't stop the press saying that they did anyway. So at the height of all of this, one of the Stonewall founders, vile anti-travelling community nightmare and Times columnist, Times, Matthew Parris used his status as a Stonewall founder to give credence to the argument that Stonewall should ditch supporting the trans community in an article with the title, "Stonewall should stay out of the trans rights war," which is nonsense for all the reasons that you have come to know and love. So, Stonewall being attacked for ridiculous reasons, but what with Parris using his founder status to twist the knife, we thought it might be a spiffy idea to have a chat to another Stonewall founder to get his take on Stonewall supporting trans people, as well as ask him about what being a Stonewall founder means in this day and age. So, we reached out to Lord Michael Cashman, a member of the House of Lords and all-round trans ally, and let's play the tape. Firstly, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, you've made your support for trans equality very clear on social media, and you've said that you approve of Stonewall's decision to support the trans community, for example.
And actually, I've also made it clear several times in the House of Lords.
Indeed.
It's been absolutely necessary to make those points in the House of Lords because of the comments by some noble peers who should know better.
So, personally then, for you, was there ever any question in your mind about this, or did it just seem completely obvious to you that the trans community is to be supported?
Either you believe in equality or you don't. You can't have inequality if you're an equality campaigner. And I mean, also, the similarities between LGB people and the depiction over the centuries, and now what I call the defamation, stigmatization, and misrepresentation of trans women, trans men, trans teenagers, the trans community, is you could swap the language. You could swap the scenarios. They are interchangeable. And if you don't recognize with your own history that it's now being visited on somebody else, you get back to the salami slicing of other people's rights. And I will never, ever do that. There's often the difficulty about the balancing of rights of competing groups, competing individuals. That's perfectly achievable if you believe in the concept of the equal protection of the law, equality before the law. And then everything else follows.
The label of Stonewall founder comes with some cachet in the community and beyond. In your opinion, how much influence should Stonewall founders have in decision-making at Stonewall in 2021?
None. Because it's a bit like, somebody put it beautifully on Twitter. They said, it's a bit like me turning up to a job I left 10 years ago, telling my old team what they should be doing in a market that I have no longer been working within. It's like turning up to, well, you're saying to your child, you can't grow in that way. When I stepped down from being chair of Stonewall, I knew that I had to let that organization go so that it could grow beyond me. And that's a courageous step to take. Nancy Kelly from Stonewall has written a really good piece about founder syndrome, and it happens in a lot of organizations. And it makes nonsense to me. The only time I've intervened with Stonewall was when Ben Summerskill was the CEO, and they were arguing whether they would go for marriage equality. And I just said, what do you not understand about the term equality? They're having an internal debate on the board about whether they accepted marriage as an institution. And for me, equality is about opting in and opting out. When we set up Stonewall, the opposition we had from some LGBT activists was incredible because they thought the territory was solely their own. And they said, who are you? What are you after? How dare you do this? And my response was, we are campaigning for equality and social justice. If you don't want to opt into it, that is absolutely your choice. And so there, I stepped when I stepped back from Stonewall, it was allow it to grow. And yeah, I think I've answered the question, but I'm absolutely clear. You step back, you kind of take the glory, the shine from the success of what an organization does. And then when it becomes a bit unpopular, or it does something you don't personally like, you challenge it. Unacceptable. An organization, especially a campaigning organization, has to work with the reality it finds itself in, the environment it finds itself in, and with the facts, and not the fantasies of founders who wish it otherwise.
I have seen Nancy Kelly on social media speaking about the founder syndrome, so I'm very glad you touched on that. So
when I say these things, I'm saying them about myself as well. Have the courage to let go, have the courage and actually be able to breathe out and let another generation take over, because it happened before us and it will go on beyond us.
So kind of sticking with the social media theme, I think, on Twitter, you put up a post on May the 22nd that spoke kind of directly about this. So those who shout the loudest at the moment about being founders were either rarely in the room or always in the room obstructing.
Yes.
Now, that was on the same day that Matthew Parris wrote an article in the Times arguing against trans inclusion. So were you talking about him with that tweet?
I've made it absolutely clear that to enter into a he said, she said, they did, we did, creates a lovely story for the media to roll on relentlessly with their trans misrepresentation and I call it out, their trans hatred. So I'm not going to, the people know who I'm talking about, and that's who I was talking to.
So what's your opinion on what Liz Truss said to the Select Committee yesterday, like seemingly dropping the LGBT action plan, her thoughts on the now defunct LGBT advisory panel, her plans for the future? What do you think? What was your take?
Absolutely predictable. I predicted it months ago. She is also in the debate on the Queen's speech, when I dealt with, amongst other things, conversion therapy, I called out the government as not being committed to delivering equality. And as I've done before, I didn't on this instance, before I cited the appalling reform proposed reform of the Gender Recognition Act. And I called them out and I said, but, don't really take my words for it. And I read from the letter that Caroline Noakes, the chair of the Women's and Equality Committee, sent to Liz Truss, where she repeated that there was a public conception of government intransigence, and it was reflected in their dealings, the committee's dealings with the ministers. So Liz Truss, it came as no surprise. If you looked at the people she's packed into the Equalities and Human Rights Commission to turn it away from being an independent agency that advises government to being an agency of government. If you look at that, again, it's equally predictable. If you look at the statements by Minister, her junior minister in the House of Commons, playing what they call cultural wars. This isn't about culture. It's about the kind of civilized society we live in. So none of this comes as a surprise. None of it comes as a surprise, having listened to some of the contributions from Baroness Berridge in the House of Lords, who's the minister responsible there. My feeling is that somehow within number 10 Downing Street, and other strands of government, that some of the religious fundamentalists seem to have gained traction and gained hold, and this is reflected in this. Equally reflected in the fudged and rebooted advice given on inclusive relationship and sex education within schools. As I said, I predicted it long ago, as did others. I think Matthew Todd on Instagram was predicting it. So we've got to be prepared to fight back and to remind people that this is the beginning of an attack, not only on trans people, but on LGBTQIA plus, and then they will go for others.
It's interesting you bring up influence of religious fundamentalist elements necessarily. Have you noticed more and more of that in Parliament? Have you noticed more lobbyists from certain groups showing up and trying to get their message to?
No, I haven't, but I've seen. Let me say this: I've seen echoes of the US evangelical approach in some of the lobbying, some of the tactics, some of the threats of litigation in order to silence people, the crowding in on people that we saw in the United States, particularly around the issue on abortion, and equally in taking fears that some have, like for instance women, and creating mythological situations to fuel that fear. It's all out of the evangelical hard right handbook.
The strategy seems to be driving a wedge, doesn't it?
It's not. It will, but you drive a wedge in order to bring in a hammer. Once you weaken, if we take that kind of image, you have a solid piece of wood, you smack it through with an axe, and you get a wedge. Once you've got the wedge, there is no strength in either part. Both have been weakened by the creation of that wedge.
Also, what would you like to see from the community when it comes to a response to both Liz Truss's new vision for LGBT equality going forward, and also maybe even these elements that are reminding you of the past, shall we say? What would you like to see the community do as a response?
Well, it has to go beyond our community. It has to be with our allies, with our employers. What we've gained, we can't lose. What our employers and trade unions have gained, we must not lose, because we now take, most of us, our entire selves to work in order to be our most engaged, our most productive. Everyone has something to lose. Our families, our mothers, our fathers, our daughters, our sisters, our brothers, our uncles, our aunts. This affects every single one. And if what I've just said, Michelle, makes no sense, I would say to people, imagine you are this person that is being misrepresented and stigmatized and discriminated against. Imagine you are in that person's shoes, and if you wouldn't want it to happen to you, then how dare you allow it to happen to another? That is the concept of a civilized society. So first of all, they have to become engaged with their member of parliament, write that letter, demanding a reply, expressing their concern about the attacks on civil liberties and human rights and the right to be yourself, the diminishing of the last 20 years commitment to creating an equal society where each of us can be judged on how we input into that society rather than on a perceived difference. Write to the Prime Minister, because I will be lobbying. Take a breath, Michael, you're getting too passionate. I will be lobbying certain members of Parliament from the Conservative Party to say, you all now boast about this being the biggest lesbian and gay parliament in the world. Now do something with your party to make sure that it reflects and represent that. You can't have the spine of a book with nothing inside. And that's what we're in danger of becoming.
Lord Cashman, Michael, thank you very much for chatting to us on the podcast today.
My pleasure. And let me just finish on this. We advance together, only together.
Lord Cashman, thank you very much.
So, quite a lot to think about there. What do you think, Michelle?
Yeah, on the Stonewall stuff, I mean, this isn't the first time we've talked to someone who has a history of founding Stonewall, which is not a history that many people have.
It's a very small number of people, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of people saying that they helped, but there's only really seems to be a small amount of people who actually did.
Yeah, there seems to be an even smaller number of people who actually did some work, but that's probably something for another time.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Like, I've not really heard of this founder syndrome before, but it makes sense to me because you start something and at a certain point you have to kind of step away. It kind of reminds me of something that Christine Burns says in this week's interview, which we'll get to shortly.
Indeed.
But yeah, I mean, it makes total sense. And why would the founders have a say in what's going on today when they're not even involved? Like, I don't think that many of the founders have been involved in any way for a couple of decades now. Like, it's got its own thing going on.
Yeah, and the founders, for the most part, have got their own things going on as well. I mean, Serene McKellen certainly does. Michael Cashman certainly does, you know. Just to give another example, it would be like, so I'm in bands. Well, you know, I'm in a band. And it would be like me going back to the band I was in when I was 17, which no longer exists, but let's pretend that it did, and saying, no, you have to stop playing this music and all the stuff that you wrote after I left, because I helped you found this band and blah. It's a bullshit way to behave for anybody, really, in any context. And yet these people who, I mean, maybe they were founders, or maybe they were just in the room while stuff was happening. Who can say?
Yeah, there is a bit of a history to this, and I say a bit because that's what it actually is. When the LGBT Alliance became a thing, and by a thing I mean at that point they were a letter in the Times and a Twitter account.
Yes.
I remember at that time we spoke to Duncan Campbell and Lisa Power.
We did indeed.
Who were both there at the start of Stonewall also. Wow, how history repeats. And at that point, we were talking about Simon Fanshawe, who seemed to be all down with the LGBT Alliance, and his inclusion sold the lie that the LGBT Alliance officially split off from Stonewall when Simon Fanshawe hadn't been involved in Stonewall for ages. And it doesn't appear that he's even that involved in the LGBT Alliance. He's not on any of their documents. He never really speaks out for them ever. He appeared in that letter, and that was it. But that was enough to create this media narrative. So at this point, there have been two anti-trans Stonewall founders who have been mentioned in the press, or in this case, written a column. We've had three.
Yeah, suck it.
And they've all said, we're founders, but Stonewall's its own thing. We haven't been involved in years, and it's up to Stonewall what they do. And also trans rights. So it's like, why isn't that a story? Why are the press making out that there's this big fat split when, if anything, based on what people have been saying and what founders have been saying, these anti-trans voices are a minority. And even if they weren't, founders don't appear to be that relevant in what Stonewall does today, especially considering the Stonewall was founded to fight Section 28, which no longer exists. Does Paris want to keep fighting Section 28 forever? Is that what he thinks Stonewall should do now?
That's a fair point. Yeah. So it's worth noting, though, that the Equality and Human Rights Commission has recently left the Diversity Champions programme, and I think that might be related to something that Lord Cashman touched on in terms of that organisation now being, rather than independent of government, it is now an arm of the government and filled up with their patsies, basically.
Yeah, they claimed it was a financial decision, and Stonewall have been very, 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 very charitable about it when they said it's great that the EHRC can lead this vital work to support LGBTQ plus employees on their own, and we continue to work with EHRC on a wide range of public policy matters. But it's hard not to think there might be some political machinations going on, especially considering the EHRC's recent movements on this. But yeah.
So there is that statement from Stonewall that you just referenced is pretty good. You know, it's got a certain amount of detail to it. It explains more than we're prepared to, essentially, on this podcast. So we're going to put a link to that statement in the description in the usual place, of course. Now, one brief last thing before we get on to the second half of our interview with Christine Burns. Last week, we said we would be looking into the situation with the government's LGBT health advisor, Dr. Michael Brady, and claims by the government in a judicial review in Northern Ireland that Dr. Brady's words in a meeting were the reason Liz Truss and the government binned plans for GRA reform. So, yeah, we're going to need more time on that, so stick with us, and when we have any information about that, when we have the truth, you will hear it here first.
We're not abandoning it. It's just trying to put together exactly what the hell that's about in a week. Turned out to be quite ambitious.
Yes, who could have said?
Yeah, so it might be a while, but we'll get there in the end. But yeah, that's the news. How do you feel after the news? Do you feel a little bit distraught, a little bit worried, a little bit concerned there, Ashley?
No more so than I was before, because living under this government as trans is kind of a full-time job, certainly in terms of the emotional labour, shall we say. Even just coping with it takes far more of my time than I would like.
So we should try and maybe listen to someone who's been involved in this kind of thing for a while and been involved with it longer than us. I think we should cut to the second half of our interview with Christine Burns.
Indeed.
To get you up to speed, for people who may not have heard last week, Christine Burns is an activist who became involved with a group called Press for Change in the early 90s. And Press for Change were seminal in advancing trans equality and eventually, as you're about to hear, played a pretty big role in shaping up the Gender Recognition Act itself. So last week, we talked about the early days of Press for Change, early court victories, how Coronation Street's Hayley Cropper in 1997 had contributed to then Home Secretary Jack Straw deciding to start a working group on trans equality, and that is basically where we left off last week. So let's play the tape and continue and end this story. I mean, when you said at the beginning how you kind of got folded into the Conservative thing, I can kind of understand it because there was no internet, and that's something that I forget. Even though I grew up in a time with no internet, where you get a letter in and you're just like, oh, okay, I can help, and then you're sort of in the fold. Whereas now I think a lot of people listening would find that idea unthinkable, because just be like, well, wouldn't you just Google them and find out what their deal is? And it's not like you could do that.
So it was also different in those days as well. You know, we had decent MPs in those days. And I've always said that there's a big difference between the grassroots of a political organisation and the people who actually, you know, prance around in Westminster. And these were nice middle-class people. I was a middle-class businesswoman. And most importantly, I'd grown up. I'd been encouraged by my parents to vote Conservative because they were the sort of aspiring middle class. They were shopkeepers. And, you know, it seemed to be that if you go back to the 60s, the sensible thing to do seemed to be to vote for Conservatives. So I just copied my parents without thinking much about it. Being an activist and really immersing myself in the truth of things that were going on besides my own lobby changed that. You know, I was asking myself questions, but it was remarkable that in the early 90s, I could ask those questions of my Conservative grassroots colleagues, and they liked it. Yeah, we were prepared. We could actually talk about we could question policy and question the consequences of it, and it was frightfully nice. And yeah, I got to know some ministers on both sides, but particularly, after that encounter with the sandwiches, I remember walking down the front at a party conference in Bournemouth, and Michael Howard was coming down the other way with his entourage, and he actually detached himself from everybody with him, came over and said, "Hey, Christine, how are you?"
I mean, if Michael Howard approached me, I'm not going to lie, I would be quite uncomfortable with it. I think a lot of our audience will find the idea, well, eventually the concept of somebody being Conservative these days,
it's different now.
Almost unthinkable.
It would be unthinkable now because, you know, you're dealing with people who are deceitful crooks in it for themselves. And there's no way you can find any humanity in there to connect with. It doesn't mean I agreed with what his policies were. You know, at the time he was trying to introduce ID cards, he brought in the change in the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. You know, there's lots of sorts of stuff that was extremely iffy. And there was low-level sleaze, you know, the Hamiltons, for instance, who were in the next constituency. I had to, sometimes had to go to parties where Neil and Hamilton were there and moving around before we realised that. So it was a different world. And I am always frightfully embarrassed about admitting to having had this period of time, for about 5 years of being closely involved in Conservative activism. And my only excuse is that, it was a different world.
Yeah, I have an embarrassing past. I was a member of the Liberal Democrats as a student for about a year. So we've all done it. Yeah. We've all kind of found ourselves in places and then just had to question ourselves and be like, is this right?
You are ideally placed, having been there on the ground in these whole processes of speaking to politicians and being involved in the drafting of these acts to an extent, makes you an ideal person to write the history of having done so. So let's talk about that. So it would be fair to say at this point that you are a trans historian and have written some books. So there's obviously Pressing Matters, volumes 1 and 2, and Trans Britain. So take us through them. What does each of those three deal with?
You know, I never imagined I would ever be a historian. I hated history at school because it was taught in such a boring way. And actually, it only really comes to life when you realise history is the stories we tell ourselves to explain how things have got to this point. So if you're going to do political activism, it's vital to know what the backstory to the status quo is. And I got to the point, I left a consultancy job I've been doing for the NHS in 2013. And that was actually when I decided to retire as well. And the first thing I did on leaving was my former colleagues there. We wanted to write a book about all the ideas that we had brought to the NHS to do equality. So I had to work out how to self-publish a book, which was the collective wisdom of all three of us. And so having done that, I thought, oh, that's actually a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. But I still had it in my mind at that time. And in 2013, it was still quite a rarity for trans people to get published, unless you wanted to deliver a traditional trans biography. And I've always characterized the old trans biographies as being, my fight to get to the operating theatre. And the book stops there.
But that's just the start of things, usually.
That's it, and that's how I view life. All my interesting history from post-transition. It's you can dismiss the stuff that came before. Everything worth talking about is in my life as me. So I was against that, and I thought, so I don't think I'm actually going to be able to sell this, particularly if I want to tell a story about what happened, because it felt incredibly niche. But I was also aware that, I was of retirement age and my brain isn't working as well as it used to. And I was scared to death of this stuff getting lost, because so much of this happens to all minorities, but particularly in our case, because we've only been described by the newspapers in a very pejorative way. They weren't interested in what we were doing. Even when we won cases, in international courts, they weren't interested in the fact that we'd actually made those things happen. It was almost as if these cases had suddenly sprung fully formed into the world without any explanation for why we should be involved in them. So I thought, future historians, real historians to me, how are they going to work? Because when people die, so many trans people, when they die, and maybe their records are up in their loft, and I've emptied a house when my parents died, and you very soon become trigger happy about what you throw away, and it wouldn't get stored, and people were dying off. And I was looking at my colleagues and thinking, we're all getting on a bit. So I thought it was vitally important to try and put this down in a coherent form, in a way that you could never get, just even if you happen to stumble on a big box of Christine's old articles or whatever. And so much of it we've done online as well. So it was ephemeral. If our website disappeared, and it did in 2008, then that's it, it's gone. So much stuff that people were starting to do in blogs. Who's keeping those? And so much of what we did was in email between us. It sits in our email archives, but probably on 5 1/4-inch floppies, some of it, and in extinct. So I started activism in WordStar and then moved on to Microsoft Word eventually. And when I came to write these books, in fact, it was quite a technical challenge to be able to access some of this material and actually be able to make sense of it. But I thought, I understand that if you're going to write a reliable history, then you've got to have something solid to tie it down. Besides, I just remember the order in which we did things. So I did spend a lot of time recovering all this stuff and then started to tell a story. And I thought, now, how do you format this? And so for Pressing Matters, I thought, I don't want to do a book about myself because that just felt wrong. But I want to tell this history in a way that engages people. So I fight on the idea that I'm actually intertwining the two together. So it is a story about my journey as an activist, woven round this exciting tale of actually us sort of coming together and making our progress from one opportunity to another, and how we thought about it and why we did that thing then. So volume 1 sort of went from the backstory to how Press for Change was formed until about 1997. And as we've discussed, that was a sort of watershed year in terms of us moving from just struggling to be heard to actually having won a case and actually starting to have officials listening to us. So that seemed to be a good place to stop. And then I rested for a bit and then did the second volume. Actually, I think it's the better one if I've got favourites. And that told the story from that point forwards. So it picks up the story of suddenly mobilising people by an email server and getting them to write to officials and derailing a process and suddenly being on people's radar and actually beginning to sort of really start to motor as a campaign. So that book takes you through from 1997 to about 2007, which is the point at which I personally felt worn out enough that I wanted to go away from that and do something else. So I think it's an adventure story in a way, but it also contains some nice snippets. It's got me falling out of bed in a hotel with the chair of the Conservative Association, for instance, in Stroud. Little thing I tossed in just to add interest.
Yeah, a bit of flavour.
A bit of flavour, yes. So I did those two, and as I said, I did them as ebooks because I didn't really think there was any chance of getting them published in print, which is a shame because looking back, I would love to have had them in print and be able to give them to people. But as it is, people can still read them, and they can read them anywhere and they can search them. And then there was a bit of a hiatus, and in 2016. I was approached by a journalist I know who used to be the literary editor for The Independent on Sunday. And we got to know each other because I'd got involved in judging the pink list and then the rainbow list. That's when we made, for instance, Paris Lee's #1 and sort of launched her career. And she said, I've just got a new job now because the Independent on Sunday had been closed down as a print paper. And she'd gone to work for a publisher and said, we'd really like to have something from you if you've got something. So I said, well, I'll have to think about it. And I thought there was an awful lot of the story about trans people's history and a lot of what I know from personal experience that hadn't been told just by telling the story of that campaign. So I thought, well, I don't want to sort of be repeating myself. And I thought, I don't have the same sort of reliable historical artifacts to write off either. So it struck me that the way to do it was to do it as an anthology. And I would structure the whole story from the sort of late 50s and through to the present day, and then find people who would actually slot in to tell the relevant parts from their point of view as eyewitnesses to the events. So that meant sort of tapping up people who were in their 70s, who I know, and tapping up people who were just starting out as activists. And the way I set about it was I didn't want to spoil the effect. So I told people only what I wanted them to write about. I didn't tell them what other people were writing. So they were writing blind. And this is a sort of test of the historical reliability of the book, because when all the manuscripts came in and I started editing them, I realized that quite often they were talking about the same events, and their stories, although they came from different angles, actually supported each other. So, when you get several witnesses saying the same thing, you think, yeah, that bit of history is bolted down. But there are also one or two interesting places where people actually had completely different views on things. And that's, I think, an indication for future historians that maybe some more work is needed there, because people have got different recollections of things. There's one particular, people have very different recall of an infamous gender clinician in the late 60s and early 70s.
Dr. Randall.
Yes. And
he did not sound like a good guy.
But people couldn't even agree on how to spell his name. I actually had to go and look up his birth certificate to find him. And it was so interesting to see those different. So there was obviously, people had different experiences of him, and I thought that was in itself quite an interesting thing. And then I thought, well, we must also see what allies have got to contribute as well. This is where I brought in Stuart Lorimer, who is a good friend of mine. Well, he was then still with Charing Cross, and I wanted him to write a history of the Charing Cross Clinic. And I brought in Lynn Jones, who as an MP had been a really important figure in our lobbying as well. So she had an insight that we didn't have. And there's somebody from one of the unions to tell a story about how unions actually had a place in our history. So there were so many different angles. And I was also looking for the things that will catch you unawares, like, the place that pop music has in trans history. So I was assembling this thing. There were so many more people on my list that I wanted to bring in. But when you get to about 400 pages, you begin to think, actually, I perhaps need to stop.
Yeah.
I feel immensely relieved to finish it, because I sort of thought, okay, the Alzheimer's can come now, because because I'm not relying on this thing working. That I've done my bit. I've made sure that the stories that we all shared from the 1960s onwards, that the backdrop to all our lives, have been told, at least as a first draft, because I would love to see other historians come along and, using Trans Britain as a sort of guidebook, pick out other places to look and actually go into things that I couldn't excavate and bring those out in more detail, because there are so many interesting stories, I think, that can be told. And understanding how we were then is a vital part of understanding who we are now, and also why the attempt to squash us will never work.
Oh, I agree.
You mentioned earlier that there are times where things definitely seemed hopeless, and I think that won't be an uncommon feeling these days, especially after the past 12 months, which have been, from my experience, probably one of the worst times to be trans in my living memory, for sure, the last year. Perfect time for a thunderstorm to show up outside my door, so if you can hear that, people, sorry, the weather, we're not in a studio, I'm in my bedroom, there's only so much I can do. But what got you through the hopeless times?
Oh, goodness. I think partly because we were working as such a close team, and we knew we were in the right. And I think we all had a faith in the belief that if the truth is on your side and you've got talented people who can present it, then that you can still overcome the lies. Because the thing about the liars is that they lie to places that will tolerate their lies, and you do not lie to courts. I noticed this in the attempt to spin the Trump steal lie in America, that even the most fervent pushers of this nonsense about the votes being stolen or whatever, when they got into a court, would not repeat their lies that they would tell Fox News. So, the heroes in my life have actually tended to be lawyers. They've tended to be people who they get out of bed in the morning because they believe in justice, and they're prepared to put in the work. Nobody who wants to fight on our side can do it in a half-hearted way. It's a massive responsibility to take on trans rights, because particularly when we are being lied about so much, because you have to get it right. I mean, in our day, it was done by people working pro bono, not being paid, and they were doing it as individuals because they believed that it was important that our rights were upheld, just because it's a matter of principle. Nowadays, in the world, when we're facing opponents who are crowdfunded and getting money quite evidently from dark sources, it needs a different technique. So I'm not having any sort of go at the fact that our legal heroes now are people who finance what they do by raising money. But it's the same principle. People only donate the money because they believe in what's right. And the fact that we are a tiny, plucky minority fighting against insuperable odds just makes it more important. Because if you don't believe in that, then you've given up on your own future and your own history, because they'll come for you eventually. So fighting this ground for trans people is in everybody's interest for the future, even if they're not directly affected now.
That just puts me in mind of the, first they came for the socialists thing, and it's like, if it's not you now, it will be. Okay, final question. So in your opinion, what kind of work would you like to see the community perhaps do more of? And do you have any advice for the budding young, the young bucks out there who want to start making the world a better place, for the young activists out there?
Oh, God, I think that's a complicated question because there are so many fronts on which people can serve. I mean, that was true in our day, that we provided a framework where people could get involved. They could use our logo, they could use our materials, they could be representing Press for Change, even though they hadn't formally joined anything. And they could do whatever their talent was. And some people used that to talk to MPs, some people wrote, some people just organised other people to do things, some people just licked envelopes. There are all sorts of ways in which people can serve, and you don't have to be a hotshot to do these things. You don't have to be prepared to put yourself into the firing line on the television or on YouTube or whatever. And that's actually quite a good model, because it also tends to mean that the people who are talented in particular ways surface in the way that they can do their best work. And I'm absolutely gobsmacked by this generation. I said in 2007 that I wanted to get out of people's way, because I was conscious that the deference given to people like myself meant that people would actually ask permission to do things. And as soon as that happens, then you actually are on the road yourself to becoming part of the problem. And I believed that the generation to follow us, Stephen and I and people like us, we grew up in a generation that gave us so much to internalize. We've got language that we've had to overcome. We've got self-hate that we've had to overcome. And we've got sort of built-in programmed limitations. If we didn't have that past, I think we would have actually been even more fierce dealing with trying to water down the Acts of Parliament that we got. And what I saw in young people coming up behind us with the benefit of the things that we'd won was they didn't have that baggage. They have a different way of doing things. They have a different way of seeing the world. They seem to be far more energetic than we ever were. And they understand how to use the tools, to learn stuff. And so when I've written history, I hope I'm just providing people the tools. I don't have to say, you must read this, although it will help if you want to become an activist, know your history. But there's so many ways in which you can learn. So you don't just have to buy my books. Yes, so I think, I in a way, I tend to limit what I say, because I think that the generation that's followed us doesn't actually need a lecture from me on how to do what it is doing fantastically already. People are so innovative, they are so articulate, they have such bravery and purpose that I just feel more and more useless. I just think my job is to be an old lady who can occasionally say useful things, I think, and not get in the way and not cock it up, because the older I get and the more detached I get from the front line, the higher the probability that I may actually do something that hurts people, not intentionally, just by accident. So I think this isn't a popular view, I think, among aging activists, but I believe strongly that there's a time that actually your biggest contribution personally is to actually sideline yourself and just be a moral support, and just to admire the fact that the next generation, as with all new generations, are always better than their parents' generation because of the benefits that they've had. That's my worldview. I don't want to sermonize to people. I just try to be helpful.
I mean, that's a really, really good answer. Christine, thank you so much for talking to us. I would say to people listening, I can't speak to the other books, but if they're as good as Trans Britain was, I'd say that they were vital too. But Trans Britain, paints a picture. And also gives you a thing where you read the history and just because I grew up with just being I'm the only one, but on a smaller level, me and Ashley both grew up on the Section 28, so the materials were kept from us, sort of indirectly, but still, because they were all folded into the gay stuff, the trans stuff as well at that time. And so reading the history and being like, oh, I'm part of a chain that goes back decades. That was mental health-wise a wonderful thing, but also I learned a lot, and I think it made me better at doing this. So.
Christine, thank you so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your evening, weekend, week, however long it is.
I think the traditional way to end an interview is just to say, thank you for chatting to us today.
There are love.
Christine, thank you for chatting to us today.
Thanks, bye.
All right. So there's quite a lot in both of those interviews. If you've listened to both parts of that, now there's a lot there, isn't there? You know, trays of salmon sandwiches aside.
Yeah, what I really didn't expect is similar to what Lord Cashman said to us about how at a certain point you step away because you need to let the new people in and the new situations into the fold, and that, I think they're both right.
I agree.
I think that's a really cool idea. I hope that when the time comes, if what the trans is still going by then, you and I will respectfully bow out and either hand off what the trans to some young new people, or just bin this entire thing and let whatever thing comes next. I mean, were you up for that, following their example?
Yeah, absolutely, because I think what Christine and Michael said about having to leave in order to let something grow, and it does kind of strike a chord, I'm sure, with the parents out there, is that, you know, your child might not grow up into the thing that you envisioned, but they have every right to do that. They have every right to not be the thing that you as a parent wanted. And so within all of the activism stuff, volunteering, whatever, there are some people who cannot let go, and they are an impediment more than they are helping by this point. And it's just like, I hope I don't end up like that, because I've watched this happen for myself in the work that I do, and I really hope I don't go the same way. So I'm thinking that there's going to come a point in however many years, you know, it might be 2, it might be 20, it's all good, but there will come a point where I'm like, okay, I need to step back from this and let other people who are more cognizant of today's thinking take it from here, because they've got this. People younger than me usually know more than I do, as I am startlingly discovering.
And you will retire to some kind of coven in the middle of the country where you will do Star Trek / witchcraft.
Yes, sometimes both. But I was thinking I might retire to a nice little lesbian bookshop.
Ah, yes, that I could see you there.
I know, right? But think of the overheads. God, I'd have to save so much money. But lesbian bookshop, awesome. Well, it doesn't have to be lesbian, actually. You know, come on, trans... All welcome style bookshop, like Gay's the Word, but in Manchester, essentially, because I love this city.
I would like to end on one idea that I had that sort of came from the last couple of weeks, because Christine Burns made the case that Hayley Cropper on Coronation Street was surprisingly, although not that surprisingly, seminal to trans rights advancement. When I was doing my research before we talked to Michael Cashman, Lord Cashman, I should say.
Indeed.
Lord Cashman, I stumbled upon all of the stuff that is well known, that he was in the cast of EastEnders. He portrayed the first gay kiss on British television in 1987, I believe.
Indeedy.
Which is just a peck on the cheek. But the thing that struck me from that was, and I didn't spend too much time on this because it was not what the interview was about.
No.
It was like basically the first 2 lines of a thing I was reading up about him.
Yeah.
The second kiss occurred like 18 months later, and it was more of a kiss, but it got nothing. The first kiss was like debates in Parliament and all of the other homophobic stuff you would expect in the 1987. The second kiss, nobody noticed or cared.
Yeah.
And that got me thinking about how we could try and use popular culture to advance trans rights in the UK, and I struck on a hell of an idea.
Yes. Go on.
We need a trans person on Bake Off, and here's my reasoning. Last year, Bake Off got 10 million viewers. We get a trans person on there who can bake and gets far enough in the series to be on it for a while. I think that would do a lot for trans acceptance and attitudes towards trans people. I think we've got to look to the past and do a Michael Cashman. We've got to do a Hayley Cropper.
Indeed.
So if you can bake,
yeah,
fucking get on Bake Off. What are you doing? Are you kidding me? You could be the hero that we have been waiting for to disturb and destroy the anti-LGBT movement in the government right now. You could be the key to turning this around, Baker at home. So if you would like to try and apply for Bake Off, please do. And also let us know so we can report on you and talk to you, because that'll be a fucking incredible story.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, swap recipes, I guess. Because I mean, I do a fair bit of oh crap!
I forgot you bake. Why the hell? Go apply for Bake Off. What the hell are you doing here? Go be a Bake Off person.
I might. I actually might.
That'd be a really weird recording thing, just being like, oh, where's Ashley? She's late. Oh, she's late from doing Bake Off.
I'm sorry, I'm late. I've been on Bake Off. Yeah. So the thing is, I tend to do better at baking, particularly like cakes and stuff, when I'm baking with somebody else, and I don't know if they let terrible twosomes on Bake Off, or if it has to be an individual.
No, and you have to know how to do things like a jus.
A jus, yes, of course.
Like that smear thing on a plate that makes it posh, apparently.
It's posh gravy, basically, jus. Anyway, thanks for sticking with us. Before I go off and start my Bake Off career, I'm kidding. Thanks for sticking with us through these chunky episodes of us speaking to Christine Burns.
Yeah, I'll be happy to know that we're taking next week off because I got to tidy my bedroom, and I wish that wasn't the reason, but it's true.
It certainly is. I can see on Michelle's Zoom window that she's not lying to you.
Yeah, it is disgusting. I am surrounded by crap.
Yes.
I need to take a week off to get this sorted out, but we'll be back.
We will.
In 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm. And we shall have all sorts of interesting, exciting, and hopefully slightly amusing things that we can talk to you about. Until then, thanks for listening. Goodbye. And should you need to catch us in the meantime, you can catch us on Facebook. Obviously, we're out there. What the Trans. Twitter, @What the Trans. We're on Medium these days, whatthetrans.medium.com. And of course, we have our shiny website, which is whatthetrans.com.
Yeah, but until we come back in 2 weeks, look after yourselves and
look after each other.
Get off Twitter sometimes because you don't want to turn up like Graham. Jesus,
Absolutely.
You don't want to turn like Graham. And Graham, if you got to this part of the episode, I'm in your head. I live in your head. But yeah, see you soon, everyone. Bye-bye. This episode of What the Trans was produced by myself, Michelle Snow, and Ashley Talbot, and was edited by myself, Mara Reynolds, and Ben Swithin. And we would like to give special thanks to our Patreon producers, who are
Ty Griffiths,
Alex Little,
Florence Stanley,
The Cthulhu Kid,
Kai Passion,
Helen,
Mallory Moore,
Chrissy Jarvis,
Stuart Gray,
Nick Ross,
Alice Chalkley,
Jasmine,
Sim,
Melody Nix,
Zoe Laura Meyer,
Fiona Punchard,
John,
Lynn McKay,
Nick Duffy,
C.B. Bailey,
Gordon Cameron,
Peter Kimball,
Rachel T.S.,
Gwen Witherup,
Vic Parsons,
Tila Wild,
Atom James,
Vanessa Billington,
Tower Watch,
Rowan Littlejohns,
Desiree Markland,
Samantha Raven,
Patreon user,
Derek Victor,
Sarah Bedful of Dogs Halliwell,
Emma Doyle,
Mike Dickinson,
Owen Willis,
Catherine,
Nina,
Elliot McVeigh,
Cassius Adair,
Tuck,
Melissa Brooks,
Ian Coomber,
Maddie Bell,
Karakan 12,
April Heller,
Sophie Lewis,
Alexandra Lilly,
Claire Scott,
Ariadne Pena,
Lauren O'Nions,
Mara Reynolds,
Bernard's Pink Jellybean,
Lanos,
and Chris Hubley. Thank you to you all. Goodbye!
Bye!